I'm going to put a link to the Sky News report in this video related to what I'm going to talk about, um, which is the Prime Minister's speech at the Lady Mayor's show in central London. Uh, I believe this is the same as the Mansion House speech. It's a formal event. The Prime Minister speaks, the Deputy Prime Minister speaks, as does the Chancellor. Now, in all honesty, I haven't watched the whole speech, but I saw an important segment in which Starmer acknowledged, he did acknowledge that China is a threat. And yet, he's rejecting what he sees as a lack of engagement. And he rejects this idea that it should be a binary thing of we either work with them or we don't. Um, I'm afraid that the Prime Minister has said nothing that gives me reassurance. I really want to believe that Labour is just being practical and they are, actually going to stand up to China at some point. But so far, all I have seen from this government is responding to criticism. That is to say, because they've been accused of being soft on China, and because the security services have been warning about security threats, they felt this need to kind of speak out. And then we had the spy scandal, or the alleged spy scandal, I should say, with the two Christophers. But all of this is Labour responding rather than preempting policy. They're responding to criticism rather than doing what they need to do, which is to stand up to Beijing. Now, what Starmer will point out is that other leaders have visited China: Trump, Macron, Merz. Um, but I'm not sure that's necessarily something to say, well, that's okay, that's fine then. Those leaders should also come under scrutiny for whether or not that's the right approach. Um, and I find it interesting, the whole world seems to kind of have collectively decided we'll just move on from COVID. This is actually very relevant because it's indicative of the way the Chinese government operates. Consider what happened in that pandemic. Now, whether it began in a lab or in a wet market is kind of beside the point in a way. What's relevant is how they responded to it. Instead of trying to contain the pandemic immediately, their first response was to punish the whistleblowing doctors. People like Li Wenliang. They said they were gossiping and causing trouble, and they tried to silence them. And in my view, that cost crucial time in which they could have contained it. It became a global pandemic in which millions died, including 250,000 people in this country. Yet the whole world has kind of seemingly decided, oh well, that's the past, let's just move on, as if it's a normal thing. And whilst the Chinese government didn't go out to, cause a worldwide pandemic to kill millions of people, their response to it speaks volumes. I've quoted this before, but I think it's relevant. When Australia called for an independent inquiry, they didn't even blame China. What was Beijing's response? They threatened to destroy the Australian wine industry. When Japan said it would militarily defend Taiwan if need be, whether or not that's the right message to send out is a matter of debate, but how did China respond? They had nationalist hawks actually talking about decapitating the Prime Minister of Japan. We've seen for years how China's wolf warrior so-called diplomats behave. They're bully boys. They lash out at anyone who, questions how China uses its power. And that's actually a very relevant point, because if China is destined to be the global hegemony, how does it use that power? Its entire philosophy is might is right. I believe strongly that the only thing the Chinese government really believes in is power. Power for power's sake. And supporters will say it's lifted millions of people out of poverty. They ignore the fact that millions and millions have died as a direct result of Chinese communism within China. Chairman Mao was arguably the biggest killer of the 20th century, based on his policies. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were hellish, devastating events that caused immense human misery. And the same regime is in power today. This is the point. I just think that there's this troubling lack of awareness or assertiveness in terms of standing up to China. You know, Western countries speak out on Russia and they stand up to Russia, and that's good. I welcome that because Putin is a thug. I think he is the biggest threat to Europe since World War II. I'm a strong supporter of Ukraine. I despise the Putin regime, and I am pleased that Starmer's government, like previous governments, have stood up to Russia. But my question is, why not also China? So there's a contradictory message. Starmer admits that China is a threat, and yet he's still planning to make a state visit next year. He's still reported to be giving the green light to this mega embassy to go ahead. Apparently the security services have sanctioned that as well, but that to me doesn't really say, oh well, they've sanctioned it so it's all fine. When the plans were submitted to the then Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, apparently there was rooms that were blacked out. Some of the plan was actually blacked out. Now, why would the Chinese side black that out if they weren't hiding something? This is scheduled to be the biggest Chinese embassy in Europe, right in the heart of London. We're only coming out of that scandal with the two Christophers. Well, we're not even out of it yet. The security services have been warning it for a long time about China's nefarious activities. And what we see is criticism of individual incidents, like the situation outside the Manchester consulate a few years ago, when consular staff were accused of trying to drag in protesters to make it look like they were the aggressors around the Hong Kong issue. To his credit, Dominic Raab, as Foreign Secretary, did put pressure on Beijing over what was happening in Hong Kong. That's a rare example of a senior British minister taking a hard line on China. But the truth is, since the Cameron-Osborne era, successive governments have spoken tough whilst in opposition and then got soft while in power. Labour did talk tough when they were in opposition. Now they're in power. One gets the impression they're just going to give China everything at once. That, to me, is unforgivable. And yes, it's true, Starmer has raised human rights concerns, and now he's acknowledged China as a threat. But like I say, so much of this seems to be responsive rather than preemptive. You know, responding to criticism rather than actually doing what they need to do. I am not saying that there should be absolutely no contact with China. That wouldn't be realistic. But one of the things Brexit has done, one of the negative things, is it's made this country overly reliant on other economies, particularly the United States and China. In my view, to our detriment. I give Starmer credit for trying to reset relations with the EU, but I think this is a Prime Minister who thinks diplomacy solves absolutely everything. And if I just talk to people, it'll all be fine. I think that's how Starmer sees it. He needs to take a more cold approach. He needs to take a more robust approach when it comes to Beijing. And say to Xi Jinping's face, we will not tolerate your government interfering in our country. You know, that will take political courage, but if you're Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that's what you need to do. And it isn't just Starmer, Rachel Reeves, other senior Labour ministers, they really, really give the impression they are very reluctant to criticise China directly. What we see is generic criticism, you know, statements like, we won't tolerate any interference from an outside state. Yet there's a refusal to kind of condemn China directly. That suggests to me that this is a government that really doesn't want to provoke Beijing. And that is a problem because it suggests that they're going to let these bullies push us around. Now, a lot of people out there don't like Starmer, they don't trust Starmer, they don't like Labour, and they'll say things like Starmer is the biggest threat to national security. I'm really, really unhappy about this stance on China, but to me that position kind of reeks of naivety about what China poses. China is a threat to this country. And anyone who can't see that is a useful idiot, really. I'm not talking, by the way, about Chinese tourists or Chinese students, unless, of course, they're promoting the party line, and some do. I'm talking about what the security services have been warning about for years. The problem with giving Beijing what it wants is they'll just encourage them to do more. I've said this before. Both approaches can cause difficulties. If the government takes a really hardline approach and publicly condemns Beijing, they will lash out and perhaps get into reprisals. So, for example, if they said, sorry, we're not going to go ahead with this mega embassy, no doubt the Chinese side would look at some way of getting into reprisals. They'd put up blocks to any British plans in China, for instance. But what's the alternative? The alternative is the risk of, for example, a major cyber attack, or that embassy being used as a base for some sort of major espionage operation. I don't think it would happen immediately, but if it's a choice between dealing with their aggressive response from a position of standing up to them, or being pushed around because they think that we're a soft touch, I think the former is preferable. And in a way, actually, provoking them isn't an entirely bad thing, because it will expose them for what they are. I truly believe that the Chinese government only cares about power. They don't care about human beings. They only care about power. This is a regime that has killed tens of millions of people with its policies over the years. That's not hyperbole. It's a fact. So I just don't think that's a regime we should be cozying up to. Starmer points to the fact that there hasn't been any direct engagement since Theresa May. Well, good. And yet, even despite that, we've still seen too much pandering. I agree with the China hawks. We need to take a hard line with Beijing, because if they see us as a soft touch, and I fear that they do, they're just going to keep pushing. Keir Starmer needs to publicly say where is his red line. Where is he going to say no to the Chinese? This country is just too damn dependent on countries we should not be cozying up to. I'm thinking particularly of China. With the EU reset, I welcome that, because it makes all the sense in the world. I think leaving the world's biggest trading bloc just was madness. And the more it goes on, even the Daily Telegraph is now conceding that Brexit probably wasn't a good idea. But one of the negative points about Brexit is it's made us overly reliant on China. What we should be doing is opening up more trade with developing countries beyond China. And yes, Indonesia on its own, Mexico on its own, Brazil on its own, etc. don't compete with China, but collectively might balance that out. I just think that over-reliance on China gives them the message they can get their own way. That's what I think is... it leaves a bitter taste in my mouth, this idea that these thugs in Beijing can just push their way around and get what they want. So, I'm very, very uneasy about the government's China stance. Saying that China's a threat isn't enough. It needs to be met with action. And unfortunately, the action right now is contradictory. Starmer acknowledges China as a threat, yet he's giving the green light to the mega embassy. He's planning to visit China, thus sending out the message, oh, relations are as normal. On that visit, if he doesn't want to be accused of being soft on China, then he needs to use that visit to really question Xi Jinping or whichever representative he meets on the fact that British parliamentarians are basically being targeted by Beijing. Starmer needs to really question them on that. Tell them to back off. I.e., if there's any sort of trade deals to be made, that has to be an absolute precondition for it. But, the Chinese response is always just denial and then to whine about xenophobia. Because they've weaponized that. They've tried to weaponize Western guilt over racism. So any concerns over national security, they'll just say it's anti-Chinese racism. Yet it's not about Chinese people. It's about the behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so I'm deeply, deeply uneasy about this. If reform can't be trusted on Russia, it's still plain to see that Labour can't be trusted on China. Rachel Reeves is cracking jokes about Farage. She shouldn't be too smug on that, because right now I don't trust Labour on China. And the more I see, the more it just seems like pandering and appeasement, and it's utterly, utterly pathetic. And if this, if we end up seeing some sort of major cyber attack, it would be an unforgivable lapse of judgment by the government. Or put another way, it would be indicative of a government that's putting economics before national security. That's unforgivable. No economic growth, no trade deal is worth the price of a national security breach. So I'm not hopeful, but I want to see Starmer taking a much tougher line. If Reform has any sense, they would hammer the government on this. I mean, I don't trust Reform, but if I was a Farage advisor, I'd be saying, push back on this one. If I was Kimmy Badenoch, I would. If I was Ed Davey, I would. I think the other parties need to be absolutely, absolutely pushing hard on this point. And one final thing I'll say, this isn't just, there's many Labour backbenchers are uneasy about it. So this isn't a case of, there's a thing about collective responsibility, cabinet collective responsibility, but there's a lot of Labour backbenchers who know full well the nature of the Chinese regime, and I'm sure they're not too happy about this either. I call on those people to show political courage and speak up, even if it means criticising your own party and your own leader, because there's nothing more sacred than national security for a government, or few things more sacred than that. It's just such an important thing, and giving a bullying superpower everything at once it's not patriotism. It's foolishness, and it's cringeworthy, quite frankly.